Hey, welcome back. It's 2025, and our first show of the year is the always exciting Words of the Year episode where we're going to talk about the words that made 2024. Everybody I see is frozen. Are we having some issue? Ben says we can't see you. I may be having some internet problems because
We can see
everybody
you
on the
now.
screen was frozen. Everybody coming in at once. You can see, I can't see anybody moving. All right, as long as you can see me. And could you hear me before when I said,
Yeah.
welcome to 2025, Words of the Year episode? Yeah, well, so if we had some technical difficulties, we'll muddle through. Anyway, Words of the Year episode, I want to start really quickly and talk about the fires in California. We got word, I think it was just yesterday, that Karen Yin, who's been on the friend of the show, been on the show twice as a guest, she lost her house sadly in the Los Angeles fires. She and her partner kind of there's a knock on the door in the middle of the night. They're fine. They got out okay, but they lost everything. There is a GoFundMe that some friends and relatives set up, and we'll put that in the chat. So if you want to contribute to that, we wish Karen the best. I hate to segue into, hey, let's have fun for the next hour, but that's what we intend to do. Let me quickly introduce our panel of international renown lexicographers from all over the world. First of all, Mark Gwynn, coming to us from tomorrow morning in Canberra, Australia. Mark Gwynn from the Australian National Dictionary Centre.
Good morning, Mark.
Mark, are you there?
Yep, I'm not in Canberra today. I'm out in the bush.
I hear you. This is good. You're out in the bush?
I'm out in the bush.
Oh, whereabouts?
Oh, it's about an hour.
Is there a town nearby or just?
About an hour out of Canberra.
Oh, okay. All right. But the Australian National Dictionary Centre is in Canberra, right? And what time is it there?
It's 8:30. It's I've been up for hours.
Oh, 8:30? Oh, I don't feel bad at all. Okay. So let's go from tomorrow morning to tonight. And Fiona McPherson, I believe, Fiona, are you still, I ask you this every year, still in Germany?
Still in Munich, yes. It's 10:30, just after 10:30. So
Still in Munich,
yep.
10:30. All right. And you you haven't picked up the German accent yet.
Not yet. Well, we'll see.
All
We'll see
right.
how it goes.
The next we'll go back another hour, and now we're in England with Lynne Murphy from the University of Sussex. Lynn has been keeping an eye on some of the international words of the year, so we'll get her to weigh in on those. And she also looks at a crossover British to American and American to British English words of the year. So welcome back, Lynn.
Thank you.
And then, and I believe we're back in the U.S. with Wendalyn Nichols, even though Wendalyn is with Cambridge Dictionary, the publishing manager at Cambridge Dictionary. You're here in this part of the world, correct?
I am. I'm in New York, out of the New York office.
Yeah.
Great to be here.
All right. Thank you. And then Peter Sokołowski from Merriam-Webster. Are you in the radio studio today?
Yes, I'm in Springfield, a mile from headquarters at Merriam-Webster, but in the NPR studio where I'm recording a jazz radio show. So
Cool. All right, but not right now. You're not like going back and forth.
no.
Good. And then finally, from the American Dialect Society, we have two people from Madison, Wisconsin, so another time zone, is Kelly Wright. And what are you doing now? You're in Madison, is that correct?
I am. I'm an assistant professor of language sciences at UW-Madison.
All right, congratulations on that.
Thank you.
And then finally, we have the person who has appeared more than anybody else on the show, other than me and Heather, is Ben Zimmer from the American Dialect Society. Hello, Ben.
Hello, good to be back. I've lost track of how many times it's been now, but we'll be hitting
I
double
know. I
digits.
tried to count myself. It's yeah, it's a lot. Ben's been on once by himself. He's been on our puzzle episodes. He's been on with his brother Carl. We did a brotherly thing one time, and then he's of course done these every year. So there may be others. I don't know. So the American Dialect Society met in Philadelphia the past weekend, and the vote in the room was that the word that was chosen as the word of the year for 2024, raw dogging. So who can someone give us a definition of that, and maybe explain a little bit about, I used to love it during the COVID times where we could like participate, where we could watch and see what was going on in the room. And I kind of missed that. And I honestly didn't even follow it on social media this time, but give us a taste of what was going on in the room.
Yes, so yes, once again we met in person for our meeting, and there were 300 or more people in the ballroom and actively participating in the discussion and voting. Yeah, we weren't able to live stream it, unfortunately, but we did have a lot of folks who were sort of live tweeting or live posting on other social media. And ultimately, the overall word of the year, of course, we had many other categories, but raw dog won after a runoff against sane washing, which we can also discuss. We defined the verb raw dog as to undertake without usual protection, preparation, or comfort, which is how that word has developed semantically from an earlier, more risque meaning having to do with having sex without a condom, which made it a racy type of thing that maybe gave it a little extra edge in some ways, in terms of the way that this term that used to have a mostly just this sexual sense has broadened, so that now you get the New York Times and the Guardian and all these outlets reporting on raw dogging, which the New York Times called a wildly obscene term that was becoming used for all sorts of other things, including the travel fad that happened in 2024 involving a passenger who sits through a flight without any distractions whatsoever, just looking straight at the map and nothing else. Yeah, Kelly, maybe take it from there in terms of
Is it
painting
really wildly obscene? I feel
that's what the New York Times said. I don't know.
That was my question. I mean, is that a bit of an exaggeration?
I spend so much time thinking about profanity. I'm like, I could give you 20 words in the next 5 seconds that are much more obscene than this one. But yeah, this year we had, like more submissions than ever, which is really exciting. We got 656 individual lexemes nominated for Word of the Year. So I'm just really excited that people were submitting, and we're submitting all year. It's a lot of fun. And yeah, the vote, the system worked as expected, as designed this year, which was really great. We had some good arguments from the floor, especially from Larry Horn and a handful of others who were on Team Raw Dog. So it ended up, sweeping that final category, which is really exciting.
So I'm familiar with the term, which is not always the case with you actually explained the whole Ussy thing to me 2 years ago. But so I looked it up in Oxford, and it's Oxford has a definition. So how long has this been? Maybe we could ask Fiona, is that something new that was recently added to Oxford? Was Oxford that much on the spot to get that in there?
Well, of course, always. Yeah, we added it to our Dictionary of Current English last year, so it's still relatively new, and we added both senses. And just thinking about the whole wildly obscene, we do label that first sense as vulgar slang. So There definitely is a little bit of an edge there. But yeah, we added it last year into the
But not wildly
dictionary
obscene.
of English.
Right.
But we don't say that. But maybe I'll need to make a note when I get back to the office tomorrow to say maybe we want to get those two words in there somewhere.
So, Mark, I just dropped a link into the chat from Nancy Friedman's newsletter. Nancy Friedman, known to many of you, a great editor and writer. And she also contributes, like I do, to the Strong Language blog devoted to sweary language. And so she gave a really nice treatment of rawdog after it won ADS Word of the Year, where she really like digs into the history, what and when these different meanings started bubbling up. It existed before there was this sexual sense, which is actually just first attested on Urban Dictionary in 2012, I believe. And you know, it's if you go to, for instance, Green's Dictionary of Slang by Jonathan Green, which Nancy mentions in her post, it did have an earlier meaning, which just pulling it up right now, I think basically to do someone dirty, basically, or to humiliate them. And that
Humiliate them.
existed. Yeah, exactly. So that predated the, you know, what first popped up on Urban Dictionary in 2002. 2002 was when it shows up. It's hard to believe Urban Dictionary has been around for that long. And then 10 years later, we see an extension where it gets defined as to go into an exam, quiz, or test without studying enough or at all beforehand. So students were taking this term that they knew as a funny sexual term and then extending it to their context of, you know, going into a classroom without being properly prepared. And so that sort of led the way, I think, for all the semantic generalization and extension and broadening that we've seen, especially in 2024. And that was brought up by Larry Horn and others in terms of how even an Urban Dictionary entry refers to semantic broadening, which is kind of amazing that this linguistic concept is actually like getting picked up by people who write things on Urban Dictionary.
Maybe, I mean, there's probably some linguists, maybe Nancy Friedman herself wrote that entry in Urban Dictionary. I asked Nancy to come on because I read that article too, and she's in the room. So thank you, Nancy. We're all very
Hi, Nancy.
We're all very impressed with your work. Nancy said something lame about jury duty, so I don't know what this, you know. It seems like an excuse, like I have to wash my hair that night, but I'm glad she's made the show tonight. So Macquarie or Macquarie, I don't know how to pronounce that, dictionary in Australia and Collins Dictionary in England both had raw dogging on their short lists. So interestingly, it's not, it's an international term. I mean, it's a term that is familiar in Australia and familiar in being used in England. So we have Mark Gwynn here from the Australian National Dictionary Centre representing the Australian branch of English for us. And so what was is this something, a term that you see used in Australia, Mark?
When I looked at it earlier last year, and I know Macquarie spoke about this too, the word was often associated here with the alpha male idea about that sort of, dare I say, toxic masculinity. It was all about being tough and getting on planes and not doing anything. But it's in what I was looking at here in Australia, raw dogging was more associated with that kind of alt-right set of terms and set of values. Interestingly, I know it's a much broader sense elsewhere, but I picked that up here in Australia, which was interesting because we've been looking at a few of these particular terms associated with that, dare I say, movement of, I'll just call it alpha male. I haven't got the best shorthand for that, but so yeah, certainly it's made its appearance here in Australia.
Well, you know, there's the bro term, right? That could be because we have broligarchy as on the list somewhere. But what was, yeah, and I used it. I said to our panel, I sent a note and said, we're going to be raw dogging the show tonight, which I took to mean as, you know, we're doing this unscripted. We're just going to be, it's just going to be a fun discussion. And am I using that correctly?
Yeah, I would say that's how it's getting used now, to go into something without preparation, just kind of winging it.
Yeah.
But it's a more evocative expression, obviously.
Right. Okay. So what was, since we're in Australia, what was the Macquarie dictionary word of the year?
Well, I mean, so Macquarie's a different beast to us. So we at the Australian National Dictionary Centre, we have our Australian National Dictionary, which is an historical dictionary.
Right.
So
I'm just asking you to speak on behalf of all of Australia.
Oh, okay, yes. So Macquarie interestingly chose enshittification, which I know was the Dialect Society's word last year.
Correct.
Yeah.
So perhaps things enshittify more slowly here in Australia. I'm not sure.
Is that a proper use, enshittify? I don't know if I've even heard that before. Yeah.
I'm sure it is.
And why not? So what was, Macquarie chose enshittification, and for rarely they do a public vote and then they choose one themselves, and for the first time it was the same term, enshittification. And we've had Cory Doctorow, who is credited with coining that term on the show, and we talked about that, so you can look that up on YouTube. A show of hands, who here had Colesworth as their word of the year? So what is Colesworth?
We make life difficult for ourselves at the Dictionary Centre by choosing an Australianism, so it can be hard enough finding the right kind of word to sum up the year. We don't do lookups here because unfortunately our dictionary is not online at this stage. So Colesworth is, and you can tell we were desperate. We chose a blend word. It's our first blend word, I think, that we've chosen as word of the year. And it's a blend of the two main supermarket brands here, Coles and Woolworths. And it's quite tricky unless you know the Australian context, but basically they're almost a cartel here, or at least a duopoly. So it's a kind of a shorthand term that has been around in fiction, interestingly, from the 1930s. And that's why we try to talk about Australian English in terms of the history of the term, of the language. But it's not really had any frequency until quite recently, particularly this last year, where there's been a lot of investigations into various price gouging and all sorts of things. So it's a kind of a dirty word that's used very negatively, and essentially just a shorthand to talk about these two supermarkets.
Did you say 1930s?
Yes. That's why that's interesting that we get to talk about these words historically, because it does have an appearance in the 1930s. Then there's a large gap before we get to the 1970s, and then it disappears. So the context is a sort of a fun fictional use of the term to refer to this nominal supermarket. But then once we get to the 21st century and now, it's very much a loaded term, and it's not used neutrally. It's certainly used to talk about the power of these two supermarkets, and it means something. Even if people don't know the word in Australia, they immediately engage with the word because they know what it's referring to.
Right. All right. And that brings up, and getting back to enshittification, was the American Dialect Society word for last year. I mentioned earlier that I believe OC was 2 years ago, which we don't need to get into exactly how that came about. But there was a post on after the voting on by the Because Language podcast on Blue Sky. They posted a fun fact: most American Dialect Org words of the year are actually motivated by linguists amused by Ben Zimmer having to say the words in public. So, no, and actually that kind of brings up a serious question. And is there, like, I mean, because you get everybody in a room and there's this big, democratic thing, it's probably after the bar has been open, I'm guessing. Is there sort of a more of a likelihood that those words are maybe not what would come up if a bunch of, elderly linguists got together around a small table and looked at the words?
Well, the American Dialect Society's meeting, and it meets in conjunction with the Linguistic Society of America, a much larger group. And the attendance from the LSA more generally, along with these sister societies, in terms of what comes to who shows up for WOTI, it's been skewing younger, which is great from my perspective. We get a lot of participation from grad students and even undergrads, and this year even high schoolers. The LSA had an initiative involving Philadelphia area high schools where linguistics is on the curriculum, and they were invited for this session during the LSA. And some of those high schoolers and their teachers showed up for Word of the Year, which was fantastic. My son, who's now a college freshman, has often been sort of like the representative, like young person, like the Gen Zer in the audience, who can fill us in on things. But now we're getting kids even younger than Blake. There were high schoolers in attendance, which was, again, great, because that is where the innovation in language is happening, whether us old fuddy-duddies like it or not.
Yeah, I honestly, I love seeing young people come and hear what they have to say. I personally want to hear from like the old guard who are in the room but never step up to the microphone these days, and so that's unfortunate.
They're intimidated.
As like the data gatherer, I do my best to make sure that we get representation from everything. It's like all of these age groups in this room have a different lexical experience of the year, and I really want to capture that. So I just like encourage more people to submit and say what they want. But I do have to say, if we were actually choosing words based on what it's just so fun to watch Ben say, the word of the year would be Hofkula. We would be, Ben would be in here talking about fellatio for the entire year, and that is not what is happening.
I was spared from that, at least.
Yeah, we've been spared from a number of things as well. We don't have to talk about the broligarchy. We aren't in here discussing forever chemicals. So I'm glad that there's at least a little levity to our choice.
Yeah, I mean, it is. Well, I mean, I think there is a tendency to go political, as well as making Ben blush. But no, this, I think this year, I honestly, I think the term, despite its sexual origins, I think it has, in my mind, has completely lost that, because I guess I was aware of both, but it doesn't, I mean, New York Times, it's funny to think of them as being embarrassed by saying something that has a completely non-sexual term is the way people are using it now.
And it is a sort of a teachable moment when it comes to semantics and the way that items like this can drift, but then still be polysemous, still have multiple meanings. There can be vulgar and non-vulgar meanings that can live side by side, and that's okay. And we can also see these processes of, this term rawdog, as we were saying, might have had a non-vulgar meaning that got vulgarized and then got devulgarized. So, despite this sort of just, seeming like, ooh, this is a naughty word, it really does have a lot to kind of tell us about the way that words evolve with their different meanings.
I think you just used the word polysemous. A great word. I don't think I've ever heard that word before.
Right. Polysemy means having multiple meanings, and then the adjective would be polysemous or polysemous. People say it different ways.
I've heard polysemous. Okay.
So in fact, on social media, since the announcement was made, there have been various arguments back and forth of like, do they know what this word really means? Like
Mhm.
these American Dialect Society people, do they actually know what raw dogging means? Like, yes, we're fully aware of the many meanings of this term, and that was part of the reason, that it won in the first place. But it does show how, sometimes when this kind of folk understanding of the way semantics works, sometimes people seem to have trouble with the idea that words can have multiple meanings, and maybe one's vulgar and one's not, and that this is just the way language works.
All right. So I assume polysemous is etymologically related to polarization, which was Merriam-Webster's word of the year.
I think
Anybody correct me?
Ben would question your
Okay.
semantic development there.
No?
No, polysemous, polysemy, of course, poly, multi. No,
Oh, yeah.
polarization is from polar, meaning poles, meaning opposite ends. And we, by the way, Ben, thank you for that semantic description of your word. That was valuable. As someone who spends a lot of time in airplanes, I don't understand the virtue of sitting staring ahead on an 11-hour flight. But okay, that's for me to discover, I guess. But as you know, Merriam-Webster does actually have experience in participatory lexicography. We had a long-running open dictionary project that preceded kind of Web 2.0 and into the Facebook era. And I know this because I was one of the people who monitored it. And it functioned much like Urban Dictionary. Urban Dictionary is such a valuable tool for lexicographers. But one thing we learned after a while is that you kind of got a lot of repetition, you got a lot of vulgarity, you got a lot of personal opinions, and not a lot of useful data. So what we have been doing for our word of the year is to report back the data, to report back the lookup data that we're so fascinated by. And with 100 million page views a month, we have a ton of that data, and it does always tell us a story about the previous year. And what we do is simply isolate the previous year's data from all of the data from the year before to see which words spiked in 2024 that did not spike in 2023. There are lots of evergreen words. The dictionary is a great way to measure the news, but it's really a better measure of the language. And so therefore there are words like integrity or fascism or democracy or ubiquitous or conundrum or affect and effect, or a couple of vulgar terms, but certainly the word love, that are among the top 100 words that are looked up every single day, every single year. So that's not interesting. What we want to do is isolate what is new and different about this year. And obviously the word polarization, like with the word vaccine in 2021, the word pandemic in 2020, this is a word that is sort of kind of all around us, and it needs no explanation. Although it's sort of interesting to point out that it evokes division, separation. We have other terms. We can say partisanship, but polarization really does emphasize separation. It emphasizes that there is a tendency toward the extremes rather than toward the center, and that seems to obviously resonate with the election year and with the all of the usage of this term, interestingly used by both sides. And of course, we also have kind of runners up, words that were looked up that had big spikes in interest. And they included totality from the solar eclipse, which is a great example of something we often see, which is a common word that is used in a very narrow, specific technical sense. If that sense is scientific or legal, especially, it sends people to the dictionary. Totality is not a hard word to spell for most people. It's not a word that's unfamiliar, but it suddenly seemed very specific. And that's something that we have always seen that cues curiosity. The word demure, I don't need to get into. We all know where that came from. Fortnite, same thing. Great. It's great that pop culture sends people to the dictionary. We love it. We love the traffic. The word pander was used again by both sides, the right and the left, to talk about the presidential campaign in different ways. The word resonate, it gets back to AI and something that we had talked about more in 2023, where not a week went by without AI being in the news. Fakes. Resonate, it turns out, is a term that occurs more frequently in artificial intelligence generated texts than in human written texts. And so it ends up being this odd word in which, in imitating human writing, makes it seem less human. And maybe my favorite of all these is the word allision with an A, as distinct from collision. So many of these, Lego words, as are sometimes referred to, the Latin prefixes and affixes. There's collision, which means together, and allision, which means one hitting another. The technical term for the crash to the Baltimore Bridge. And lastly, we had the word weird. It seems like a million years ago when that was in the news, but it was certainly a word that was looked up. My guess in this case is it was looked up a lot because it's hard to spell. And the data doesn't lie, but we're good at reading data. We're not good at reading minds. I have a feeling that in the case of weird, it was simply a spelling issue, but that's terrific. That's a great reason to go to the dictionary. And we have the term democracy, which is always among our top lookups, and in fact was our first word of the year in 2003, and the term cognitive from the debates, again, on both sides about the cognitive decline or ability of major candidates. Anyway, so that's my little quick resume.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much. And it is interesting with weird because, I mean, that would be something you often do see these words, Peter, that people are not looking them up for spelling or definition, really. They're just sort of wondering, is this sort of generally applied right? Or, I mean, totality is not that difficult. Polarization, I don't think is that uncommon that people don't know it, that they should be running to the dictionary to look it up. But you may be right with weird, but even if it were spelled a single way, people would be looking it up because it was used in the presidential election. So interesting. I can't help myself. I looked up, the etymology of course, polarization, and thinking there must be a pole commonality, but it's poly and pole, and they seem to be unrelated, just a coincidental thing, unless we go back before Latin somewhere. Okay, so you mentioned demure, which was dictionary.com chose demure. Now, dictionary.com, how do I say this? They laid off all their lexicographers early in the year, which was, it was such a great group of people involved there. And
I see we do have John Kelly here, by the way.
Yes, I saw John Kelly in the room. Hi, John.
I'm here. Fun. How can you resist hearing all these great folks talk about words of the year? No comment on the layoffs.
All right, we're gonna get. John and I have talked about doing that word chat. Future guest, John Kelly, maybe next month. I don't know, but we'll work that out. Anyway, I think they did a decent job of. I mean, demure was a word, and Peter, you said it. We don't need to talk about it, but a lot of people don't understand. I mean, it's not a new word. It just sort of gained TikTok popularity, right? So Kelly's nodding. Kelly, I feel like you're our go-to HEP person to talk about the trending, what the young people are talking about.
And do you remember the creator's name?
Jules LeBron was her name.
Jules LeBron.
Yeah.
And it really did have a good blip, I think, which is why we added our wild card category of this year. It's fun while it lasted, which is great because when I was culling the data, I made a potential category for bleakest word of the year. And so I'm very much glad that we went in the direction of fun instead of that. And so, very demure, very mindful. It's interesting how quickly it kind of skyrocketed into general public discourse with brands going after it so quickly and then immediately died. It's just fascinating.
Yeah. So just to follow up on that, we did create this bonus category, most fun while it lasted, word of the year, because there were just so many of these things that kind of blipped up and then faded away. We wanted to sort of recognize that they had their moment in 2024. Before demure, of course, we had brat summer, thanks to Charlie XCX and her album Brat. And Brat ended up winning that category. But you know, following Brat Summer, that's when Jules LeBron, this beauty influencer, plus size trans woman on TikTok, started saying very demure, very mindful. And so Brat Summer was over, and then Demure Fall or Demure Autumn started right after that. So even if these things only lasted for a little while, they sort of evanescent online trendlets or whatever you want to call them, it's fun to be able to say, yes, that was part of 2024 as well.
Right, right. Yeah, and Brat was the Collins Dictionary in England word of the year. And was it on anybody else's short list, Brat?
It was our second, if you want
Oh,
to
was it? Yeah,
segue
okay.
into me.
Yeah, I was going to say
Jump right
that I
in.
was just about to go there. So Cambridge had Manifest, which is a little bit of a surprise to me in the U.S. I wonder, you know, Manifest. We learn about Manifest Destiny in school, or at least if you're my age, that was sort of part of the social studies curriculum.
Yep.
Is it as big of a word? Is it known in England, or what's the history of it there?
Has nothing to do with England. So, particularly, you know, we're a global website, and like Peter, you know, we're looking at we had something like 274 billion page views, you know, a year. It's just because the people spend so much time on the site, they don't just come, look, and gone, you know. So, and there's a lot of data there. Peter's already talked about the noise you can get. At the top of your list, there's always hello, you know, as if people will type into the search bar, pronunciation, you know, and a lot of sex words, you know. So we see the perennial things, and you just have to rule out that noise. And then you start looking at, well, what's higher than usual, right? And we saw that Manifest was right. It wasn't the biggest jump, but it jumped quite a lot. You know, the word resilience had actually a lot more lookups than Manifest. Well, not like 20,000 more, but you know, more. And but it didn't hit our other 2 points. So whenever we do a word of the year, we want to hit the trifecta, right? There's the data driven. You know, there's got to be a story in the data somewhere that's coming from what people are actually looking for on the site. It's got to, you know, hit the zeitgeist. And for us, I'll talk about that with Manifest in a sec. And then thirdly, it's got to say something about language that we can particularly highlight as a learner's dictionary, right? So one year we had Homer, because that whole American British thing, and Lynn helped us with that. That was really cool. You know, that and Wordle was the zeitgeist that year. This year, Manifest had that particular meaning of using techniques, you know, like visualization and actualization, to try to essentially make your desired thing happen. Is itself 100 years old. The history of the word 600 years old. You know, Dina, who's on this call, one of our senior editors, came up with the timeline that we put on our website for the history of Manifest. And for us to be able to look at how all of a sudden this meaning that grows in the new thought, you know, from that American philosophical movement of the late 19th century, related to spiritualism, related to Christian Science, and that whole cauldron of things that was cooking at the time. That meaning was used then, but it just kind of stayed in that self-help world or the spiritualism world, just very, you know, along like at the bottom of the meanings of Manifest, until the pandemic. And so there were TikTok influencers all of a sudden saying, you can manifest your best life. Here's how to do it. Here's how to get through. And that it just captured something that people needed. So we, as a learner's dictionary, don't always have all of the most obscure meanings. We added that meaning in 23 because of what we had seen happening, right? And then in 24, it stepped out of that realm and into the mainstream, you know, and the lookups went up because Dua Lipa, you know, all these Olympic athletes in England, you know, there was a Ollie, A striker. I always forget his surname. Dina can pop on it. Oh, Lynn, you can tell me who the Ollie guy is. That okay, never mind. All of them.
Lynn shaking her head no.
No, she can't. Yeah. So for us, that was it wasn't just as you know, you said the flash in the pan kind of using demure, using brat, and using a standard word in an ironic way is creative, but it's not a new word in the dictionary. And the other thing is our word has to be in the dictionary. You got to be able to look up that meaning. We're not going to add those meanings all of a sudden for something that's that ephemeral, right? So for us, it just, and also the other thing was I'm sitting there and I'm telling my team, nobody's going to choose this one. You know, somebody's going to pick brat. Somebody's going to pick demure. We are not going to have the same word as someone else. So, you know,
this is true. Yeah.
I called it, you know.
Yeah.
But
Did anybody else have manifest as was it on the radar? I mean, did Merriam-Webster see a manifest spike or pick up at all?
Sure, we definitely talked about it. It's a fascinating use. I'm not sure we have a very good sense for that new sense that you added is such a good it's such a good idea. But the idea of a learner's dictionary is I just treasure that distinction. It's such an important distinction to make, and that's why it's so important that there's that beautiful site that Wendy that Cambridge has.
Oh, thanks, Peter. And I was also really aware too of the value of the ongoing scholarship of historical lexicography that Merriam is doing, especially with the demise of the active lexicography on dictionary.com, which breaks my heart because, as many of you know, I was the editorial director of Random House's reference division before they laid us all off, you know, more than 20 years ago now, if you can believe it. But that, you know, for us to delve into the history of manifest, we had to do our own research because we couldn't just say, well, what does the OED say? What does Merriam say? Right. You know, and so that was a bit fun because that's kind of outside our usual wheelhouse, you know. For a learner's dictionary, we're focusing very much on the usage. But the other fun bit was the narrative that we do, kind of a deep dive into the language. We have this big page devoted to it on the site every year where we can show all the different ways the verb is used, the adjective, the noun, you know, the complexity and rich patterns that was a really great one to tackle from, we can do some lessons that we can, you know, throw into a PDF and give to teachers around this. So it's also really rich mining for the marketing people, you know, which they always appreciate. There's lots of hooks to get in there.
Right. Well, let's go to let's stay in England or really Germany or really internationally. And Oxford chose brain rot as its word of the year. What was now is that did somebody else have brain rot on a list?
It was on quite a few lists of people, I think. Yeah.
It was also our digital word of the year for the American
That's
dialect.
right. I saw that.
Oh, okay. So it's not. So it's an international term. What? How did that come to the fore?
Well, the way we don't base our word of the year on lookups, we will interrogate our corpus, which is, I think, 26 billion words. It gets updated every month, and I think that's where we're at just now. And that's taken mostly from it's taken from web sources, news reports. It's international, so it will cover current affairs, sports, you know, everything that you might read about in news stories. And so we can look at that in a similar way to see what are we seeing surges in usage of compared to the last 12 months, say. And that's how we had a short list this year, which we similarly had done last year. And then we picked these 6 words and put it out to a public vote to see, you know, what the public thought of these words. And I think brain rot, well, aside from getting all the, but it's 2 words, you know, so it reminded me that because I think we've gone with last year because we went with Riz and that was 1 single word. You forgot how that can sometimes be a little bit controversial, the fact that.
But brain rot's a closed compound increasingly.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, exactly. And that's
I've seen it both ways, yeah.
Yeah, I've seen it, I think, 2 words hyphenated and completely closed. So the 2-word version was the one that we saw most of in our data. So that's why we went with that. And also, as I like to say, we think of it as a single unit of meaning, but single unit of meaning of the year doesn't really trip off the tongue all that well. So, and the interesting thing again, and this has been borne out, I think, by the conversation we've been having, is it's almost like there's nothing new under the sun this year. So many of the words that we were actually seeing were ones which had a really long history. Once you did, even some of them you didn't even have to do the research for to know that. So demure, that goes back to like the 1300s or whenever. So many of these words have got such a long history, but they've been given this, I don't know, new lease of life in some way. Maybe the context is slightly narrowed, or maybe it's, just become a bit more specific. But these words are being almost repurposed by, and, you were talking about the kids getting involved. I mean, that's the way it's got to go, right? Otherwise, we're all doomed. And I think that's partly why brain rot stood out. So it's this whole idea that, there's this deterioration of your mental state or your critical thinking skills because you're consuming all of this inane and unedifying material, especially online. Okay, that's fine. But our research showed that it was first used thus far, as we all know, we never like to completely say definitely the first usage, back in 1854 by Thoreau. So even back then, people were thinking, hang on, am I not exercising my brain enough? And if you look through the decades following there, you're seeing people being worried about watching too much TV, reading too many trashy novels, trashy magazines, all of that kind of thing. So the concept has definitely been around, and people were calling it brain rot then. But I think it's really in the last year that it's kind of cemented itself as a term. And I think we probably have to thank the kids a little bit for that, because it's become a massive thing on TikTok. And it shows this self-awareness because they're using it about themselves. So they kind of, I think, are appreciating, maybe some of this stuff's not actually all that great. And then, of course, they've begun to use it of the actual material itself. So as well as giving yourself brain rot, you can be consuming brain rot. And I think certainly that for me was what made it stand out. Because when we were first doing our research and having our conversations about it, I looked at it and I thought, really? And then we looked into it a bit more, and I was like, actually, there's something here. What Wendalyn was saying, we, as lexicographers, we want that, we kind of really want that history to be there as well, unless it's a brand new word that's just arrived, and then we can get enthused and excited by that just as much. But with a word that sort of, brain rot, it's not very exciting sounding, but that whole history, I think, was what really, I think that's why we were kind of behind it. But we did let the public, have their say, but they also got behind it as well. So,
Yeah.
but so many of the words, like demure, as you were saying, we had our short list. I think the newest one on there was probably romantasy, which is a genre of fiction which blends romance and fantasy. And that is from 2008. That's we found. I mean, I had a little soft spot for dynamic pricing, but because it has this Swedish etymology, which was
does it?
completely which was completely unknown to me until we sort of had a look, and it actually turned out it was already an OED. My Swedish is non-existent basically, but it's something like dynamiska prisbilden. And that was when it was first used back in the 1920s. So for me, that took what's kind of a really straightforward compound, dynamic and pricing. That kind of elevated it a little bit, but sadly, I say sadly, sadly for me anyway, that didn't quite elevate it enough to be word of the year. But that's okay. We can live with that. But yeah, I think definitely the fact that brain rot is something which has been in this self-awareness, as I said, which people are using it now, they're recognizing it. I think that's definitely what's helped make it cement itself as yes, we've got the concept, yes, this word has been around, this term has been around to describe it, but now it's really taken hold. And I think because it was on so many other people's radar, I know this isn't a competition, but I'm going to claim that it's the most worthy one because we were the ones who chose it, and everybody else was just thinking about it. Come on, you've got to try and get ahead somehow. We're not like...
very OED, very Oxford
well,
of you.
But you've got to give it a go, right? So we're not the American Dialect Society, so you take what you can get.
Well, the American Dialect Society does say we are the final word, which is actually, they're the last. So as far as
well,
I
we
know,
wouldn't have
so
got
there.
Luigi or any of his productive compounds if we hadn't waited.
Yeah, there were things
Right.
that happened at the end of 2024 that we were able to react to. But Brain Rot had a lot of great discussion. Again,
Oh,
in
yeah.
large part thanks to the younger members of the crowd, who are also sort of pointing out the kind of the linguistic element of this. I mean, we already said that brain rot can be like the mental deterioration or the media that causes it, but it can also describe this sort of phenomenon of stringing together all these kind of Gen Z or Gen Alpha slang terms like skibbity, Riz, Sigma, Ohio, and so forth, for just kind of the nonsensical pleasure of it. And that gets labeled as brain rot as well.
Yeah, it's got a lot of application, I think, and that's great. We're back to the polysemy again, aren't we?
Yeah. So a lot of we were talking about the international, a lot of the different words from around the year, and how a lot of them have a lot of commonality, like dynamic pricing. Certainly is something I'm familiar with in America, but let's go beyond English. Let's get to Lynne Murphy. And Lynne, what are some of your favorite non-English words of the year?
I don't know if I have favorites, but I've got about 40 words here.
40, okay.
Yeah, and I've divided them into categories. The biggest category is about politics, of course, and sometimes it's international. I mean, the Dutch also went for polarization. Sometimes it's very local, so you've got bussification in Ukraine about how young men are being pressed into being drafted on the streets, essentially, stuck on a bus. So you've got politics. We've got my second biggest category is the sort of youthy ones, which Fiona described as involving some self-awareness. I took some of them as involving a lot of hyper-individualization. So we've got Sigma for a sort of lone wolf in Polish youth word of the year. We've got Turkish had, I don't know how to say it, kalabalik yalnizlik, meaning crowded loneliness. So the experience of, so this sort of very individualistic thing. What I did find interesting in the youth words of the year were how many of them were borrowings from English. So Russian was vibe, spelt in the Cyrillic alphabet. Dutch children's word was bruh. Chinese youth word was damn. And Sigma also, I think we can consider a borrowing. German youth word of the year was aura, and I'm not sure if that's come from America or from English or not. There were a few climate-related ones. Icelandic had lava cooling, Frauenkeiling. I don't know if I'm saying it anywhere near right. Spanish had Dana, which is a name for a kind of atmospheric pressure that has caused flooding in Spain. And yeah, so just lots and lots and lots of words.
And what did you do a loan word both ways this year?
Yes, I did. So
okay.
I do British to American and American to British transatlantic words of the year. My only rule is that they have to have somehow been important to the year, not that they necessarily transferred during the year. So for US to UK, I did landslide, which we more than doubled its usage in Britain this year because of the Labour election, but also because of climate issues, because of actual landslides. That's been going up. It's an originally American word from the 1820s. The British version is landslip. But it's been going up and up and up in British since the 1980s. maybe has something to do with the 1975 song by Fleetwood Mac. I don't know. So that word has been used a lot here, and a lot of British people did not realize it was American in origin. So I like to point these things out. And the British to American one is fortnight, because of the Taylor Swift song. And again, that was one where lots of British people seemed really surprised to find out that Americans don't use the word fortnight.
I personally been advocating for fortnight for years. I mean, I think that's one word we should make.
One thing that was interesting to me was how many times in reaction to it on social media, British people were saying, please, 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 Americans start using fortnightly. And it was always the adverb that they wanted Americans to start using, because that's what's really useful. We're going to meet fortnightly, because it takes away the problems of bi-monthly and bi-weekly.
Right.
But what I found when I looked up those numbers is that that has not gone up in America too much. So we're seeing the Swifty effect, but not probably real lexical change. Yeah.
Maybe given time we'll get the adverb. All right, we're at our hour, but the American Dialect Society discussed another like 30 or 40 or 50 words. Maybe just what are some of the, let's just quickly talk about some of the words that we haven't talked about. And you know what, if you're in the room, we've got nearly 50 people participating in the room, go ahead and toss into chat what your word of the year is. And it could be something we discussed or something that we haven't discussed. But I'm curious to see what people like as their word of the year, and what and anybody on our panel, you know, we will certainly it may be something that the American Dialect Society went through, like I want to talk about oligarchy, but are there some other words that that we haven't talked about that we really should talk about?
Can I just I was interested in cooked. The Dialect Society's cooked. We've totally exhausted because an important term in Australian English only recently in the last 3 or 4 years since the pandemic is cooker. And a cooker is someone who is a conspiracy theorist. And we're still trying to work out what the etymology for that word is. And we think it has something to do with cooked on drugs, tired, fatigued. So it's interesting because it's very much an Australian term, cooker, but it's interesting to see cooked coming up because I wasn't sure how cooked was being used in American and British English. So that interested me here in Australia.
Yeah, interesting. Cooked doesn't seem to be at all a new term to me.
It has had a number of colloquial meanings, but it did really take off, not just in the sense of totally exhausted or depleted, but it can convey a sense of hopelessness or desperation as well, or just being completely broken by the situation beyond repair. And so to say I'm cooked is, you know, really dramatic. But what's fun about the verb cook, though, is it has these two different meanings. A year ago, we're talking about like let him cook, you know, as a positive thing, like let someone really go off. But then to say I'm cooked has the sort of the negative valuation. I'm sure Kelly, you've got a lot more on that.
Yeah, because Kelly's doing the negative words this year, right?
We're all feeling cooked.
Yeah. What else?
I really like the XIX. So the gasp I gust or the scream I scrumped.
Yeah, explain that.
That one's a lot of fun. It's our only snow clone this year. You know, last year we had a whole category of snow clones, and this year, you know, we've just got the XIX. But people really had lots of great things to say about that from the microphone, and it's so fun to see strong verbs, even if they're not real strong verbs, being strengthened, and interesting irregulars and variations in spelling where, you know, people are using these things online, but, you know, yeah, the meaning is transparent. So it's a lot of fun to just have that space for variation and play.
That one in our most creative category.
Yeah.
Right.
And so that one's probably my favorite.
the press release says, the gasp I gusped, and the scream I screamed, or
Scrumped.
screamt.
Scrumped.
Yeah, scrumped.
As the fake irregular form
Yeah.
of the verb, yes.
I mean, yeah, I mean, you got to get excited about irregular verbs. And
Someone said more ablaut is good.
said what?
We'll take more ablaut.
Ablaut.
Oh,
The way that the vowel changes in the verb
Yeah.
is called ablaut.
yes.
A little historical linguistics for you there.
All right, what else? We got no time left, but what else? Anybody? All right, well, oligarchy, I wanted to talk about that. So that's, I mean, that seems like it's maybe that's sort of new end of the year. We got that one guy, ex guy is the Trump whisperer, and that sort of typifies the idea of to me of the bro culture of, you know, the tech billionaires exerting influence over our democracy.
Yeah,
Can
I have
I
a feeling
throw
we'll be.
in- Sorry.
Sorry.
I was
Go
just
ahead.
going to say, can I throw in the
Yeah.
Economist's kakistocracy?
Oh yeah, of
Kakistocracy.
course. Right.
Very useful
Yeah.
term.
Yeah, kakistocracy, which came up especially at the end of the year when the first list of nominees for cabinet positions came out, and
So governance by the worst people. I have a feeling that along with oligarchy and sane washing, which we mentioned earlier, will be words we'll be hearing quite a lot of for the next 4 years.
yeah. Nancy Friedman in chat said that oligarchy and slop to do with AI, which I'm not familiar with, were her favorites, were her choices for word of the year.
I was going to say
What-
kakistocracy goes actually back to 1644. The OED
Oh,
has
yeah.
we found an example from there. So kind of seems like governing by the worst citizens has been around for a long time.
Right. All right. I guess we have to pull the plug because time is up. People have to go to dinner. People in Europe have to go to bed. And people in Australia have to get on with their day. So thank you very much, everybody, for a delightful hour. Thank you to all our guests. It was wonderful to do this. We'll do it again next year for sure. We've got to keep getting Ben back every year at least. And we will be back next month. We don't have it scheduled yet, but we'll let you know what our next show is. Thanks very much, everybody, and we'll see you soon.